Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for Intro to Governance, Principles of Good Governance for Nonprofits and Charities. This session is a part of our Integral Intro series, where we provide foundational education in key areas of nonprofit management. And we hope this session provides some valuable insight and helps you along your governance journey today. My name is Chelsea. I'm the manager of projects here at IntegralOrg, and I'll be hosting today's session, so you can reach me in the chat at any time. To support your accessibility needs today, you can turn on the closed captioning feature at the bottom of the Zoom window. The live transcription option will help you follow along today's session. This feature is also available on the recording of this session, which you will receive. I will drop a link in the chat now for more information about Zoom and closed captioning. And we'd like to start today's session with a land acknowledgement. We would like to acknowledge that IntegralOrg is based out of Mohkinstsis, which is the Blackfoot name for elbow. This refers to the confluence of the Elbow and Bow rivers that run through Treaty 7 territory. Mohkinstsis is the traditional territory of the Blackfoot Confederacy, which includes the Siksika, Piikani, and Kainai nations, as well as the Stoney Nakoda First Nations, Tsuut'ina First Nation, and the Métis Nation of Alberta, District 5 and 6. We have a long way to go in addressing the tension between the legal and governance structures that we work within in the nonprofit sector and ongoing efforts towards truth and reconciliation. At IntegralOrg, we accept our responsibility to work toward reconciling this tension, and we commit to remaining in a position of humility as we consider our history and current reality, knowing that the answers are not always clear and easy ones, yet require engagement from all of us. We all have a connection and responsibility to the lands that host our lives, our communities, and our work. With that, I would like to introduce our facilitator for today, Mike Grogan. I'll spotlight him for you now. Mike is president and CEO of IntegralOrg and brings 30 years of experience to strategy development and sustainable planning. He's recognized for his ability to tackle complex issues and develop impactful and lasting solutions that fit the changing needs of organizations and the nonprofit sector. Mike, thank you so much for being here. I will pass it over to you.
Well, thank you, Chelsea, and thank you all for being here. It is a pleasure to be here, and I really appreciate the time that you take to come and join us on these sessions. I know that in whatever type of nonprofit you work with, whether that's a big, large, lots of staff nonprofit, or as many on this call are, grassroots or working board type nonprofits, the time is precious, and we do want to honor that. Today we're going to talk about a number of things, and as I've sort of gone through this presentation and looking at who's here and some of the questions that you submitted in advance, I have decided to sort of modify this a little bit. So put a little more content on working boards. So we're going to cover all these things. Some stuff I might sort of truncate a bit, some stuff I might go a little farther on. So we'll talk about roles and responsibilities, what these things called boards are. What they should do as a collective, but also what as an individual you're going to focus on, because boards are made up of individuals who work in this kind of team environment. We'll talk about working boards and then the relationship between board and staff if you have them, because there are some differences there. We'll talk about how you need to sort of focus on areas to tune up a board, and every board needs some work. Doesn't matter who you are, how long you've been around, our board, your board, the boards I sit on. There's things we do well and things we should attend to all the time. And then I'll give you a little bit at the end, just a little bit of different theory of how to sort of elevate the role of the board. And how do you get people engaged in ways that are beyond the general, so let's get things done, or fiduciary kind of things. How do we sort of think about things more? How boards can sort of work on the strategic and generative sides. And then as always, we will leave with some tools and resources. And again, this is just a teaser in some ways. Boards are a challenging kind of thing. But if there's anything we say along the way, certainly pop a question in the chat. Chelsea will monitor that. But also, reach out afterwards. We're here to talk. This is our job, is to walk alongside you, to meet you where you are. And we'd love to do it through workshops like this. But even, after this, there's probably questions you might have. Just reach out. We'll give you a link to do that, just to have a conversation. That's part we want to do. So we'll get through all that in the next 55 minutes, sort of. We'll see. Okay, let's try. Okay. So I like to start with this, and this is a quote that I use quite often when I'm doing governance work. And this is from an article that came out 2 or 3 years ago, 4 years ago. Oh, there we go. Time's flying. Boards are a unique and curious leadership structure. And I think that just in some ways summarizes a lot of what nonprofit boards are. They are not like almost any other entity that I can understand. They are not like a family. They're not like a team. They're not like a business unit. They're not like a group of friends. They have elements of some of those things, perhaps. But they are a group where you're sometimes brought together or thrust together with a group of people who might have a similar passion to you, but not exactly the same. When we start doing work with either strategy or governance organizations, we talk a lot about why people join an organization and what brings them there. And those are quite aligned sometimes. There's overlap, but it's not the same. So you have this sort of model where you've got people who are kind of aligned, kind of work in the same direction, but not always the same. And that's that curious structure, because you have all the power. In a nonprofit, the board is the legal authority. They have all the responsibility of the organization. They may choose to delegate some another way, but that's a delegation. It does sit with them. So you have all the power, but you can only work as a collective. So you're in this kind of weird sort of 6 or 10 or 20-legged race kind of thing where you're tied together and can only move as a collective. And sometimes we get into problems when we start not doing that, when people start saying, well, I'm the chair, therefore I can do these things. But unless you've decided that as a collective, it's probably not the best way to go. So no individual board member has any more power unless you've sort of decided that, and you have to work as a collective. You also sit in governance, and this is where we'll pull apart this working board kind of policy board or model, and to say that you do oversee everything. You sit atop the organization, which is a great vantage point. That's what boards should do. You're responsible for the whole thing. You're not just looking down at the day-to-day. You're here to figure out what's the next year look like, the next 5 years look like. But also this relationship between people inside the organization, whether it be staff or board or volunteers, clients in some way, and those outside it too. So there's this weird dynamic you have at a board. It all fits into this kind of model we have governance, which is quite well established in Alberta. I think got lots of flaws, but no one's come up with a model that kind of fits it better. So we'll talk about sort of your experience on boards, what works well, what doesn't. Along the way, again, any questions you have, pop in the chat or do follow us up later on. So moving ahead, Chelsea, there we go. On a scale, we're going to do a poll. So on a scale of 1 to 5, this is going to pop up here. How would you rate your understanding of nonprofit governance? Chelsea's going to launch the poll here, and you'll give me an answer, and we'll see if these things pop up here. There we go. 3s, 4s. Well, why am I teaching this stuff? And you folks should be up here. Here we go. Quite a range. Great. So fantastic. So keep going. We'll see what comes up here. Little skewed towards the middle and the upper levels. Fantastic. Oh, there's Lori. How you doing? And I guess my hope in this, and this is why I'll do some broad ranging stuff with this presentation, is say we'll try and cover those who've got a little more understanding. But again, along the way, we're all learning. I've worked for boards for most of my life. I sit on boards, I teach governance, and some days I think, boy, I don't really understand this model at all. So thanks for that, and we'll try and gear our stuff to whatever. Oh, there we go. Let's share the results there. That's what you got. Lots kind of in the middle to the upper end of the scale there. All right, I'm going to turn that off and move us along here. So a different definition of being a board is this, and this is from the Chartered Professional Accountants of Canada. And the nice thing about these folks is they're accountants, so they're very detail-oriented. They're Canadian, and we'll talk about Canadian sources, which is really important. For those of you who are joining us from Alberta, which I think a lot of you are, where we're located, you want to find material that's related to your jurisdiction. So we'll talk about things in the Societies Act and the Companies Act in Alberta. Concepts like this one are more Canada-wide. They're important too. So we'll put this group at the end of the presentation, the resource list, but they've got some really plain language. They update their stuff all the time. It's jurisdictionally compliant, which is nice for us, and it's accessible. And they've got a whole bunch of guidelines on what it means to be a board, risk management for boards, social enterprise for boards, and things like that. So really practical set of tools from the Accountants of Canada. So their definition is this. Oh, hang on, don't get too far ahead of me. It's the board is responsible for all aspects of the organization, period. It's got a comma there. I'm going to say it's a period. You're responsible for everything. It's not like if you got a CEO or if you're on a board, you're only partly responsible because somebody else on the board is doing that. The board as a collective is responsible for all aspects of the organization. You got to oversee operations. You got to hold management accountable if you have staff. And if it's yourself doing the management side of things, how you hold yourself accountable. We'll touch on that. So those are the things of the board. You're the ones, the buck stops with you, I guess is the bottom line there. And boards are required to make decisions that are in the organization's best interest. So on the fiduciary duties, sounds good when you read it this way. The problem is to have a common understanding of what the best interest of the organization is. It is how do you I may think it's one thing, you may think it's another thing, so how do we come to that collective understanding? So that's the technical definition. We'll break this down a little bit more as we wander through this. The roles and responsibilities of board members, we'll sort of walk through this collectively first and then what the individual roles are. Okay. So as a board, some basic sort of guidelines for this, and I think some of these folks have been on boards, you know this well, but you focus on the whole organization. Sometimes we come into an organization and we think, I'm here because I love the program. So I'm here to help the programs advance. Fair enough. That's a great passion. You should bring that. It doesn't mean, though, that you're not responsible for learning about and overseeing other parts of the organization that perhaps are not in your sort of wheelhouse. So you have things like financial statements and things like that. You have perhaps maybe other risk management things or fundraising things. Boards focus on the whole. And so we need to make sure as a board, you're not just thinking about the things we like to do. There's things we all like to do better than others. We focus on the whole of the organization. We work together as a whole too. Again, the board is a collective. It's not like, we you can divvy up roles and there's clarity of roles. And you can have sort of delegation of duties here and there. But you do need to work together as a board when you're governing and having those discussions and those sort of the back and forth. You have to work as a collective. You speak with one voice, and this is got some sort of practical parts to it as well, perhaps some quasi-legal parts in terms of an organization. You are like an individual. And so as the board, you are treated like we are one voice. Inside the boardroom table, you're having a conversation on the board, you have individual voices. You can battle it out if that's the case. You can go back and forth, disagree to whatever level you want. When you leave that board meeting or leave that board table, you come out with one voice. So it's not like, well, half the board thinks this and half the board thinks that. You come out with one voice. And that's really important for staff, so they're not getting pulled different directions, for funders and stakeholders to say, well, I'm not quite sure where you're going. Some of you say this, some of you say that. It is a way of making sure that the board is actually acting as a collective. If you can't get to that, if you're on a board and saying, listen, I have my opinion and no one's listening to me, there comes times when if you can't do this, you need to step off the board, which is unfortunate. But to have fractions or factions of the board, sorry, or fraction, sure, both words work. They're the idea that that's not a healthy organization. So how you get to that, the internal dialogue process of the engagement, that's there's lots of ways to do that, but you speak with one voice. Boards approve and monitor policy, and board policies can be kind of a tricky thing. Sometimes it can be quite dry. They don't have to be. Policies are the way that boards exercise their will. And why we have them is because board members come and go. So as we make up these rules and these policies of how we're going to do our work, you don't want to change that every time somebody new comes to the table. And so they provide some commonality, some clarity, some continuity that allows you to do these things. They also are a way of separating some of the governance function from the operational function. So in working boards, these might get a little more confused, but there is a role for policy to make sure that you're clear, you're consistent, and you're compliant. One of the things that might happen, you don't see boards get into a lot of trouble with the regulators sometimes, but it does happen. They may come back and say, well, what is your policy on this? And to say, well, I don't have one, that's probably not the best way to go. So there is a bit of a safety thing to your risk management in using policy. The next two I put a little star beside, because if you don't have an employee or you're doing the operations as well, then these probably have a little more nuance. We'll unpack that in a minute or two here. But generally, boards that are maybe the traditional board with a larger organization or growing organization, where you have an employee, you have one employee. So my organization, we have a board of 7 or 8 people. We have a CEO. And so I am the board's only employee. Now, the IntegralOrg has other employees who work for the organization, but you don't have the board supervising multiple employees. It just creates lots of confusion. And in general, again, the idea that there is a separation between governance and management, and the idea that boards should stay out of management decisions. Now, working boards, more nuanced, we'll get back to in a second, but you don't want boards who are here to govern, to make sure we're compliant and doing all the risk management things, the strategic and general conversation. You probably don't want them picking the photocopy or color paper or weighing in on font size or all those things that boards sometimes like to do. So there's this idea that how do we step out of that role of being operational? We'll talk about when you're wearing 2 hats, but generally when you're governing, you govern. When you're operating, either other people do it or you've got a different role to sort of adhere to. Yeah, I think that's a great point, Laurie. Sometimes you do see, there is some, in arts organizations, sometimes there are some dual blended roles. Arts organizations sometimes have somebody who's the artistic director and maybe the business manager or CEO, and they're kind of peers, which is a whole different dynamic. And I think there's we did a session on shared leadership, and I think it's an interesting one because you have this sort of parallel peer relationship and then 2 people point at the board. Need for a lot more clarity. The idea of structures and policies, that is a harder model. I can be a very powerful model. You'll see some organizations, even not in arts, you'll see co-leadership sometimes. There are organizations that have co-executive directors. So you've got those sort of sideways dynamics and then up to the board dynamics. It's a little more complex and I think more time consuming. Can be very powerful, good model, maybe not for everyone. Go ahead, Chelsea. Just that's the stuff of the collective of the board. We'll come back to some of that in a minute or 2 here. But we join boards as individuals. So you all do board recruitment and you find ways to get people on your board. And just as a side, because I tend to do this, it's hard to get people on boards these days. I mean, the volunteerism has dropped in this province across the country probably since COVID. People say it hasn't come back from those levels. I don't know if we're getting back to those levels. I think it might be a more longer term shift. And boards are feeling that. It's hard to get people to sit on boards. I mean, there's 30,000 nonprofits roughly operating in this province. If you think 5-ish minimum board members, up to 10 or 15 sometimes, that's getting a little big. But that's hundreds of thousands of people, and a lot of people. Yes, Earl, we're going to pass this on to you, so don't worry about that. So getting people sitting on the board is tough. So if you're struggling, and I know a lot of organizations we deal with are struggling with this, it's not just you. But it doesn't mean you can just sort of say, well, that's just the way it is. We've got to find ways to make this more attractive. There are some strategies from the governance side that are working on this, but we'll see how long until they sort of take effect. So we join as board. If we can find these folks, we come as individuals. And so as an individual, there are some things you need to do. You have what we call fiduciary duties as being on a board. Notice that fiduciary means to take care of something, to tend to something, to steward something. And so you come with 2 duties. In other jurisdictions, you might see 2 or 3 or more. You see a duty of obedience, perhaps. There's some things here we don't tend to talk about in Alberta because they're not tied to the Act as much. We have these 2. Duty of care. To act with the competence, diligence that a reasonably prudent person with similar knowledge and expertise would exercise in comparable circumstances. So to care for the organization. I find this is a problematic statement. This is a very technical one. This is pretty standard. It has a lot of ambiguity to it in my mind. The competence and diligence that a reasonably prudent person would be, well, that's got some gray area to it. Similar knowledge and expertise in comparable circumstances. Lots of things to juggle with that. So how do we sort of make sense of this? There's things that we can do that would help with this, though. So, I mean, one of the things is you bring your expertise. If I'm an accountant and I join a board, the standard, such that it is that I'm going to have more knowledge and expertise about accounting matters, and therefore I need to act as such. I need to bring that competence, that diligence to my process, my discussions. It doesn't mean that if I'm a nurse sitting on a board and I don't have an accounting background, that I'm totally not responsible for the accounting matters. It's just that my personal experience may be a bit different. So bring who you are, bring your experiences to the board, be clear about those things, be clear about the things you don't know too. Part of caring for things is not just I'm an expert in stuff, it's asking the questions about things you don't know. Prepare yourself for meetings, things like that. All kinds of stuff in that. So we have more material on this, we can sort of go into that. but you need to tend to the organization. The second duty is the duty of loyalty, to act with honesty and good faith in the best interest of the organization. At a personal level, this is a bit different from that. Overall, the board needs to make decisions in the best interest, because that's a collective view, but very similar. So this is where conflict of interest probably comes into play. You cannot benefit personally from sitting on a board. It doesn't mean you can't have conflicts. You can certainly, we all have conflicts here and there, but how you deal with those, how they're declared, how you at the board works with those, what their process or the policies may be once somebody declares a conflict. So sometimes if you have, say your spouse is working for an organization you're going to rent their facility from, that's probably a conflict of interest. So you might, this might be the perception of it, might be the real conflict, probably better to err on the side of caution and say, I'm not sure this is a conflict. I may not personally benefit from it, but it may be seen as such. So you declare them. There may be ways to do that in writing, sometimes it's verbal, sometimes the level of sort of what you have to do after that changes. If it's really serious or significant, perhaps you recuse yourself from discussions. Sometimes you recuse yourself from the meeting where those discussions are happening. You don't weigh in on the decisions around that conflict is kind of the basic rule here. This is an area that probably needs to be tightened up for a lot of organizations. And depending on the act that you're under, there is some guidance there. So you would sort of take your drive, your authority from the act, the Societies Act in Alberta, or the Part 9 Companies Act, down to your bylaws, down to your policies. It also means like you're here again, not just for one part of the organization. You can't be here to say, I'm just here to support the CEO because I'm a friend of theirs, so I'm here to just for them. No, you're here because you're doing what's best for the organization. So these are two kind of good duties for people to think about, that you do have some personal responsibility and perhaps some personal liability when we don't follow these things through as far as we should. Keep going, Johnson. Here. And just so you know where this comes from, we don't sort of just make up these levels of authority. You are given, when you're a nonprofit, you've been given certain rights and privileges and responsibilities, and those sit largely with government. So the way the structure works, we'll spend a lot of time on this, is we have these acts, this legislation that says there are good things in the world that we want to see happen. So we're going to give some responsibilities, things called nonprofits, to do work on behalf of others. And that really is the key thing, is the nonprofits work as a collective for others, not just for ourselves, or maybe sometimes work for groups of people, but that is the idea of why we have a nonprofit. So it goes from the act down to your objects, why you're created. This is what you're going to do. We're going to do these things. You have bylaws that tells you how you're governed, who a member is, how you hold your meetings, how you do the basic stuff. Our style of IntegralOrg, we write bylaws and policies and keep the bylaws as simple as we can, because they're harder to change. They're changed by members. Keep policies a little more nimble because they be changed by the board. And the policies in governance sense are what the organization will do, how we're going to structure ourselves sort of in terms of meetings, when we're going to do things, what our code of conducts are, things like that. So lots of good resources out for governance. If you're looking for good policies, there is a site called Governing Good, I think, in Alberta. Yeah, governinggood.ca. Lots of free open access policies. Just remember, when you take them, they're licensed, they're open to use, they've done the copyright stuff, but make sure they fit you. Sometimes we take policies from organizations and we adapt them. We realize, well, that wasn't really what you meant. Policies and bylaws are usually only an issue when there's a problem. And a lot of times they sit on the shelves, we don't really read them, we don't really understand them until something happens, and we point back to these rule books and say, we didn't follow this. Well, you probably haven't been following it for a long time. But there is, some things to attend to. So look at your policies frequently. Not the funnest thing sometimes, but it's a good thing to do. And procedures, how we do our work. So really quick one on that, and we can put some more information in the chat. Chelsea will probably find Governing Good for you there. Pop it in. Moving ahead, Chelsea. So just really to be an effective board, I guess a lot of common sense here, nothing probably earth-shattering. You understand what good governance, you got to practice good governance. Governance is like, it's like an exercise, it's like a muscle. And if you never use that muscle, it doesn't actually get stronger. It doesn't actually work as well. So a lot of things, and I would say that for most organizations, it's tough to focus on their own board, like to take care of your own house as a board. We like to do the work we're doing for sort of working board to get out and change the world. We love to sort of have maybe different kinds of conversations sometimes about the fiduciary or financials or program stuff if you're a policy board. But a part of being a board is you take care of yourself. You take care of your own development. You take care of your learning. You take care of your relationships. There's lots of structural things or technical things we'll talk about in governance. The heart of governance is a team sport. If you're not attending to being a team and we're having constructive and challenging and fruitful conversations, it's probably not that effective as a board, not as effective as a board perhaps. So taking care of governance, ensuring the long-term sustainability of organizations. Boards may be starting doing the day-to-day work, so you've got your head down and looking at what's happening the next couple of days here, the next few steps you're taking. But in addition to that, it is that we're looking at the longer term. This is where the role of boards being strategic and generative to say, our job is not just to make sure tomorrow goes well, the next year goes well, the next 5 years goes well. We're thinking in those ways as well. So sometimes that's a bit of a duality in that, but sometimes we get caught up in the day-to-day and perhaps not be as focused on the horizon as we should. Make sure you have some strategy. I mean, you can go back and forth on what strategy looks like. You can sort of think, is it really loose and kind of broad lanes? Strategies are good. We do a lot of strategic work as well at Integral. It's, they don't just sort of tell you what to do, they tell you what not to do. Sometimes we think in nonprofits, we think, oh, I can just leave my options open, I'll go down that path. May well work for you. There's organizations that do that. But a lot of times you sort of meander and it's tough to get a sense of where you're going. You don't have that focus, you're not on the same page. So it's part of the board's role to ensure there are strategies. Loose strategies, sort of really big ones, really tight ones, up to you, but something that gives you some idea of where you're going, what you'll say yes to, and what you'll say no to. If you have a senior executive, the board is there to hire, guide, direct, and evaluate them. If you don't, then forget about that one. No matter who you are, though, ensure your policies are up to date. Again, it's just that clarity, that continuity, and a bit of risk management as well. Again, this is part of good governance. The board's responsible for recruiting and developing their board members. Again, challenges right now in recruiting, but if you've got folks, how do you make sure they're developed? And part of that sort of the skills development, maybe that's more social kind of things, but how do you tend to that good governance stuff? And this is a role, the last one here is boards are ambassadors. And I think that is one of the things that is so powerful about being on a board, being a volunteer on a board. There is something when you're speaking to community or funders or government sometimes, whatever it might be, if somebody's speaking to you as a volunteer, that's different than somebody who's paid to do it. So I'm paid by IntegralOrg, and I think I'm pretty good at what I do, but it's different when my board chair comes to a meeting and says, this is why I'm here. This is why I believe in that organization. That carries a different message, a different voice for us. And so I think that role of board members being ambassadors is super important. It means we need to equip board members to do that. Key messaging, making sure they're not just, saying one thing we don't actually do. Sometimes we have to figure that out. But that idea of sort of waving the flag is a really, really important role for board members. Some of the things we're seeing right now in on boards are, the lack of clarity, and about roles, responsibilities, and the activities of boards and individual board members. So how to make sure that everybody knows what their job is, not in a rigid sense, not in saying these are the rules that you'll follow, but I think that idea of clarity. This is what I'm supposed to be doing. A lot of folks join boards and I'm not quite sure how I'm supposed to do this stuff. So that clarity of role, responsibilities, and how these things all work together. I think a lot of times it's challenging to utilize the skills of board members. Saying I want to help out, but my skills are kind of doing the operational side. So how does it fit with my desire to be on this board, but I'm being told I shouldn't do management things, or I'm not in the skill lane. So how do we make sure that people's passions and skills align with the needs of the organization? Like anything, these are human constructs. The boards are, we're made up of humans, and so you have relationships in these things, and sometimes there's just poor relationships on boards. You have them in all kinds of walks of life. Boards are no different. Then we did see this in COVID a lot. These points where people are in distress, and it was showing up in boards, and you're seeing yelling matches in some of the board meetings we have or watched or facilitated. Sometimes I think those relationships are important. The technical duties, the fiduciary duties, the how we do things are really important. At the end of the day, it's the relationships that are going to make these things sing. Again, how to recruit and engage board members, probably talked a bit about that. And then how we organize our work, how we do committees, how we have things like when we do meetings, things like that. There's never probably a sweet spot for this. It's going to sort of ebb and flow over time, but to attend to these things, I joined a board once that had 10 board members and had 14 committees. You kind of think, holy smokes, do the math on that. Like every one of them almost. And so how to sort of restructure things, You know, that's the nice thing about leading some of these decisions about structure to the policy side of the equation, because you can change them at, you know, when you need to do those sort of things. So make sure that the structure of the form gets you what you want in terms of the function. Just a quick poll again. I want to see in this group here, we have here, there's probably on the board here, just who has no paid staff, who has a senior executive, and maybe some other ones that would fit kind of that stuff that Lori put in there. Just quickly. Intrigued that there's so many others. Yeah. So in this one we have, I'm trying to think, maybe share it. We'll end it and share it, Chelsea. There we go. I can do that. Quarter with no paid staff. Oh, about half with senior executive. That's good. So we'll spend a bit of time on both of those pieces right now, and the other, I'll just be left to wonder what that is. So there we go. Moving forward here. Yep.
We actually had a question in the chat, Mike, related to the other category. So what if the organization does not have a CEO and we have to supervise all the staff of the organization? So no CEO, but staff.
Yeah, that's correct. That's good. That's a great clarification. Sometimes you can have staff who are not the executive staff. So you have boards who really have this management function as well, and have maybe administrative or program staff. When we get to the next couple slides, that perhaps become a bit clearer. Just, you know, there's probably no one, there's sort of traditional models or more common models. There's a million ways to structure nonprofits. So maybe I'll sort of touch back on that one in a minute here. Okay, keep going. Yeah. Ooh, corruption. Yeah, I could do that, but that's an interesting question in the chat. Just, you know, I'm going to talk about working boards. And so when the board has no staff, or perhaps administrative staff, so you haven't delegated authority. And that's probably the defining point is if you're a board that's larger, and you said, I've got the board, I've got a CEO or executive director, maybe another title in there, you've actually given away authority through a policy. You've written a delegation of authority, things they can and cannot do. If you're a board that sort of maintains all the authority but needs some help doing the work programmatically, administratively, then you're probably closer to the working board model here. So, so you have this responsibility for both the governance, so you have to oversee the whole thing and do the day-to-day work. So those are the differences, and that can get quite confusing for folks to say, well, am I really managing the organization, doing programs, or am I governing? And so it does take a little more work to do this. So understanding the governance function and pulling that apart. All boards govern organizations. There's no such thing as a governing board and another kind of board. Everybody's a governing board. You may have other duties as well in terms of the operational side, the programmatic side, if you have no staff or perhaps, you know, administrative or program staff. What else? Yeah. Slow transition. There we go. So this is kind of a rough model. Again, lots of ways of sort of pulling these things apart. In a working board, no staff or administrative staff, the governance is the board of directors. Same thing in a governing board. We all govern. Management, that's sort of structuring how we'll do our work, that making some decisions on the day-to-day or longer term stuff. For a governance board, on the right side here again, we've hired a CEO, senior executive, executive director. In the working board, that's the entire board of directors, or perhaps you delegate it to a sub part of the board of directors, an executive committee. So they're responsible for that management function, sort of that shorter term planning, not the long term stuff, but how we're going to get from day to day here and there. Then who does the work, the operational side? The working board, volunteers, maybe admin staff. In the governing board, you have maybe more paid staff doing that. So you have this confusion where sometimes confusion lies is, okay, if I'm governing and I'm doing the actual day-to-day work, we've got to pull those apart a bit more. Okay. Chelsea, there we go. So one of the things that's interesting is I think people think that governing working boards, the ones that, you know, the senior executive are simpler. I don't think they are. They actually take more work sometimes. We don't necessarily tend to put that effort in sometimes. I think that's what confuses us sometimes, is they are a harder model. It's fairly it's easy for my board, but they've delegated a lot of stuff to me, and that's fine. That's their job. But to sort of, when they don't do that, we've got to make sure our structures, our roles, our accountabilities. Sometimes it can be almost pedantic and say, right now I'm wearing the governance hat. We're going to have a governance discussion. And 5 minutes later, we're going to take the governance hat off. We're going to have an operational discussion. So there is more need for clarity and structure. And as the organization grows, you may move from being a working board to a more governing board, or policy governing board. And that process needs to be really well managed because it's hard to make transitions. So they're not necessarily easier. They probably take more work or a different kind of work than just saying, we're just here to do the work. And that's what a lot of nonprofits start as. We want to do the work. We want to go change the world. Fantastic. So we're all should be here to do that. That governance function, we can't, that's part of good governance. We cannot fail to pay attention to that. Some myths about working boards, they're only for small nonprofits. No, there can be fairly substantive nonprofits that have working boards that do a lot of this themselves. There's no reason to that. There tends to be a point where you start to say it gets too complex, or not as efficient. Time becomes an issue here. So you do tend to start to move towards their part-time executive director, full-time or more staff. But you don't have to be small. There's some ones I've seen an organization $1 million that, or two, I think the biggest one, that don't, they have this administrative staff, but they have no intention of having that traditional model. The board members should only focus on governance. No, you can be in multiple roles as a board, as a governor, as a board director. It's just being really clear when you're not. Right now, I'm working as a director. Now I'm working as a volunteer on the operational side. Working boards are temporary. You know, this province has 30,000 nonprofits. Probably about 56% of them have no staff, and some of them have no intention of being bigger than that. It's not like everybody says they're going to start small, with a few of us, and grow to be the United Way. Not everybody has that aspiration. So working boards may be the model you want to go with for the rest of your life. Fantastic. There's no pressure to do anything else different than that. All board members must have nonprofit experience. If we had this criteria, no one would be on a board. You got to start somewhere. It's how you build people up, how you give them the skills. If they haven't got that experience, do some board development, train them, show them videos like this, have us come in and talk to you, whatever it might be. There's a million ways to build experience. But I think getting new voices, and voices who probably haven't been as either jaded by the experience or bring new perspectives, is a really good thing for boards. Working boards less professional, I don't think that's true at all. I think they be very professional and very structured and really well managed as other boards. There's nothing that says size or the complexity that changes that way. And they can't handle complex issues. There's boards who handle very complex issues in society. I mean, there's all kinds of ways of doing it. So not to be limited, these are not less than, they're just different than other types of boards. The other side of the equation is board and staff. So when you move to in this type of organization, now we're talking about senior staff in this one, so not so much the administrator for program staff. I'll have to spend a few minutes on this. I'll probably jump through a few slides here just in terms of time, Chelsea, but keep going, but I'm going to skip this one. So when we have this delegation of authority, the board has all the responsibility, but we've given some away. So that is usually that should be a formal process. So if you're a CEO or an executive director, other title in that senior role, that needs to be really clearly defined, and that's both a risk management process for the board to say we've given some authority away. We probably should be clear what we're giving away and what we're keeping for ourselves. It provides some clarity and some continuity and all those good things as well. So, but what we tend to see is that boards have this overall responsibility, but they've delegated the authority for somebody to manage and do sort of the strategic side of the organization. A lot of those duties include things like building relationships with stakeholders, funders, external stakeholders. Doesn't mean the boards aren't involved in that, but a lot of times that's delegated. The CEO reports back to the board. This is a relationship. You've been given some authority, but you've got to report back on what's happening operationally and financially, those kind of things as the CEO. Prepares budgets and operational plans. Budgets, you might say, could be a shared one. Sometimes treasurers are part of this. A lot of times it's staff, and it's a sort of working thing because staff know what you're kind of doing and where you're going to spend money, and the board has responsibility to approve the budget, but sometimes that's developed by the staff and operational plan. Supports the development of the board. I think this is a good one. It is the idea that the board development's up to you as a board. It's not my job to develop my board. It's my job to help you do that, to bring you information, to present opportunities, to broaden perspectives here and there. But the board is still responsible for doing that. But it is an area that we need some help with sometimes. And for the CEO, it's to request consultation and support from the board in their individual areas of expertise. And this is where it gets tricky sometimes. So I might be an HR professional sitting on the board. It's not my job to go and start to sort of tell the CEO, you should be doing this, you should be doing this. This is how you do your HR policy. That is stepping into operational issues. Where it can happen, though, if it's done well, is for me as the CEO to say, geez, I really don't understand HR. Can you be a resource for me? Can you consult with me on this? So it's driven from the executive back to the board, not mandated back from the board down to the executive. And that's when we talk about separating those roles of governance and management. That's kind of the dynamic here. Maybe not ever quite as clean as that, but that's in theory how it should work. So the role of the board overall is to set the direction, that setting, refining a purpose and mission and direction, that high level stuff, that sits with the board. Oversight to make sure that we're taking the activities and health and ethical behaviors happening, and to ensure the organization has resources to equip itself. So those are the three really big functions for a board. Conversely, the role of the executive is to execute. You've got this big purpose and vision, and you've got these things to do. Your job is to get it done. So planning, directing, implementing, so those active kind of words. And the second piece is informing. How do you make sure you're not getting too far ahead of the board? How do you provide relevant, timely information? One of the worst things you can do as a CEO is to get too far ahead of your board. Something good, something bad, doesn't matter what it is. If you're out of step with your board, that's when things start to come apart, because this is a relationship. This is shared leadership. This is the success of the board is going to depend on the success of the executive director and vice versa. That is kind of the definition of shared leadership. It is a construct that is, again, kind of unique and curious, but super, super important to get that relationship right. And there's kind of an adage in the nonprofit world that either boards run roughshod over executive directors or executive directors run roughshod over boards. Not healthy, probably true a lot of times, but how do we find that synergy, that sweet spot? We're all in our lane, pulling in the same direction. Again, that does take a fair bit of work. One of the challenges, and this is from an article a few years ago again, just the idea that it's hard to be on a board to know what to do. So you kind of get these two kind of questions. Either the board is sidelined for strategic issues because you don't know enough about things. We do a lot of board and strategy planning with groups, and you say, boards say, well, I'm not quite sure I have enough information to make big strategic decisions. I don't know really about our clients. I may know a bit about our funding, what's reported back out to me, but I'm making some big decisions, got all this authority, but I don't really have all the information I need. So you let the CEO or the executive director do it. Conversely, though, there's the other side of this question, is to say, well, sometimes board can make those decisions without having the information, saying, I got a good idea. I want us to move it into this kind of programming, without knowing that that's maybe something that's not appropriate, it's not feasible, all those kind of things. So how do you find this place where boards have enough information to make strategic decisions, do oversight, without kind of being too sidelined or too in the weeds, making kind of dumb decisions? That's a tough thing. That's relationships, and that's information, and that's working it through. But the dissolution of a nonprofit is going to be the responsibility of the board. If you're dissolving, you probably don't have a CEO. It's in the chat there, a question popped up. Largely, it's going to sit with the board. At the end of the day, it sits with the board. So if you're dissolving, you probably got rid of your CEO or executive by the time you're dissolving. It's going to sit with the board. So I think that idea that there is a partnership, it's got to be attended to. So I spend a lot of time with my board chair. I spend probably 2 or 3 hours a week with them. Some weeks, maybe more than that. A lot of times, that's outside of board meetings. That relationship, that making sure I understand what the board needs, what they want, I understand where they're going, they understand what I'm thinking. So this relationship, and we have our role structured, but it's probably more the relational things that make that kind of thing. Go ahead, Chelsea. Yeah. Keep going. Let's get up. Now I've talked about that with other. This what you should expect as a senior executive. So what should the senior executive expect from the board? They do speak with one voice. This is why that's important. If one board member is telling me this, and the board member is telling me this, that's not one voice. And then these are my bosses. If you've got conflicting messages from your bosses, who do you follow? The idea of my expectation is that they should attend to the process and culture of being a good board. That's a reasonable expectation. It's not my job to make you a good board. It's not my job to help you, but an expectation you're going to take care of your own house. It's my expectation that through discussion, they're going to support my decisions. If they're not, there should be a process for doing that, but it can't be that there is a trust relationship here. And if I've been delegated authority and I'm well thought out, I've got reasons for doing these things, that there is support for the decisions. They should set my performance standards. They should be making those things up, and I should expect that I know what those are. And again, this honesty and openness and candor and respect, just a basic human relationship that is no different from the other way. Conversely, though, in addition to this, what should the board expect from me? Same sort of thing. They should expect that be informed, no surprises, that the information is there and they need it. It's accessible to all, not just some of them, depending on how you structure yourself. That it's not just the information, but the insights. I mean, one of the things about having a CEO or an executive is they're professionals, and they understand things in a different way than perhaps board members would not. That the board should be treated as a collection of equals. We all have different relationships. Some people click with better, perhaps, but they are a collective, and I need to treat them as a collective. They're equal in that sense. That they too need to be supported in the decisions. There's things the board may decide that I don't agree with, but that's the way of the world. I work for them. They're responsible, and so I need to respect their decisions. And if I can't, well, then maybe it's time for this relationship to end. They need to be supported in development. It's not them to take care of that, but I need to support that. And again, that honest and open and candid. So we have different expectations, different roles, but getting this relationship right is really, really important for nonprofits. Oh, what do you got next? Every board needs some work, and this is maybe something we can take. We do when we sort of work directly with boards, and we spend a bit more time on this. But just a few tips, perhaps, to say, well, how can we sort of provide some structure? It's hard to go in and say, let's fix our board or look at the things that need to be tuned up. Couple to three different lanes here, perhaps, to tune up, to think about here, what you might want to do. So we asked some different questions to boards. We'll probably go to different working groups and be a little more structured than this, perhaps. But just, how well do our board capacities, the people we have on the board, the processes, the roles, the structures, all those things that sort of allow us to be board, how well do they serve us? Do we have the right committees? Are we meeting at the right time? Do we have enough people? Are the people well equipped? So to have some of these questions, they're not right or wrong. It's just to ask these questions. What do we need to do to build ourselves up? There's not a board in the world that can probably use some tune-ups in this area because it's ongoing. Our development is always something we need to attend to. How meaningful are the connections that we have? This is both an informational piece, an insight piece, kind of relational here in the well. But how well is the board connected in terms of itself, in terms of its own understanding, its team dynamic between the board and the CEO, and in the community? And boards are here to make good things happen in the community, but we sit outside that sometimes, or distant from that. So how do we understand and make those connections? How does information flow? How do we build relationships? Those connections to the board are super important. And then the culture of the board. How do we do our work? What do we believe about being together? How shall we be as a team? What are the norms that we're going to work under? Not many boards focus on that. Not as many boards focus on that. How are we going to have our dialogue? Sometimes we have values. A lot of organizations have values. Sometimes they're sort of there and kind of in the background. Sometimes they're just stuff that kind of sound generic. But what are our real expectations for how we'll have conversations? How will we make decisions? How does it affect the way of being? How will we build some social time into our boards? I think boards that don't spend time, even a little bit of time, sharing a meal or spending some time outside the board meeting, just getting to know each other, and that personal side of things. That goes a long way. It may not seem as productive. Some folks say we're busy. Let's just get through the board meeting. Let's get through the fiduciary stuff. We're fine. Boards that spend some time on culture, I think, are far more impactful. What do we have for time? I'm going to give you just a really quick view of another body of knowledge. What you've kind of got was kind of governance 101. You'll get that in a lot of different formats. So fiduciary duties, how you work as a board, the roles, responsibilities. That is the sort of basics of governance. It's fantastic. But keep going, Chelsea. Yeah. This is a book that came out probably 15 years ago, and I still draw parts of it quite a bit because it sort of made the idea that governance discussions focused on fiduciary duties, that taking care of things, and that boards were kind of there just as the overseer, the traffic cop. We're here just to direct things. We're not quite as fulsomely developed as we should. And the idea that was too limiting, that boards should view themselves as agents of change. We're here to build the world up. We're here to change the world, fulfill our mission. Because you look at most missions, they are quite change-oriented. They're definitely change-oriented. And so how do we sort of take people out of those duties you have and build upon those things, not take them out of those things, but build upon the basic understandings of board and give boards room to sort of flex their muscle a bit. We talk about the earlier comment about how board members aren't quite sure where to bring their skills. If it's only fiduciary duties, that's quite limiting. They, the authors of the book, I think, it's called Governance as Leadership by Kate, Ryan, and Taylor in 2005. This that's 20 years ago. Holy smokes, I'm getting old. It they focus on three duties. Fiduciary duty, very clear what we've just gone through this stuff. So fiduciary duty is taking care of the assets and overseeing things like audits, budget, risk management, that kind of stuff. We're good at this kind of stuff in nonprofits. A lot of our language, a lot of our structures, a lot of our practices are based on this kind of stuff. The roles are usually pretty clearly defined, either inside the board or this board to staff relationship. We're pretty good about pulling those roles apart. Board does this, staff does this. If you only do this, though, it's essential. You got to do these things. I'm not saying throw this away. There's kind of layered concepts. But if you only do this, you limit the role of the board. You know, it's not enough to sort of fully engage all the things about boards that I think are really wonderful. It's this collective body that can do some great things. So if we only stick with fiduciary, we don't grow, we don't stretch, we don't use that thinking, that strategic part of the board's brain or the collective brain that we want to get to. So the strategic governance is this. This is the next layer of strategy. And I think most boards do this quite well. Sometimes not. Sometimes we'll do strategy without the boards there. Not the best model in my case, but people can choose what they want to do. But this deepens the role. So again, it goes back to the idea that boards have a strategic focus. And so fiduciary, perhaps more day-to-day. Strategic, now you're starting to think out longer term. And what you think is a strategic framework changes from time to time. Right now, I think 18 months is not bad strategic framework. We sort of think when uncertainty grows, you sort of shorten your planning horizons on strategy. It's fairly uncertain out there right now, but that could be dependent on the type of industry you're in. But it's this shared relationship between the board and the staff, because the staff know what the day-to-day and all the stuff you're doing with looks like. Board has responsibility of thinking, okay, what the next 2 or 3 years look like for us. So in terms of strategy, though, the board's role is on the directions and concepts. The staff is on the details and carrying it out. Again, pulling those roles apart a bit more. It's very much a partnership role. This is a partnership between board and CEO, maybe board and senior staff. This is a shared responsibility. Now, technically, it may lie with the board to make sure it's done. To actually work on the strategic side takes that partnership on. But it means that we got to share more information. So if staff have all the information about the day-to-day and the funding agreements and sort of state of the world in terms of nonprofits, board tend to come in as lay people. It's not bad, but they have different experiences. So we've got to build some information, some knowledge, some equipping, so that the board can make those kind of decisions. And the last, and this gets a little abstract. And so if you're board members, you think, I really like nuts and bolts and getting sort of things done, and you know, I want to know brass tacks. I want to sort of be really clear. This one gets a little tricky because this is generative governance, and this is the idea of being a sense maker. And sometimes you think of it as being time bound. So when you think fiduciary is kind of day to day or the next little bit, strategic, 1 to 3 to 5 years, generative governance is kind of those questions about what's going to happen 10 years out from now. Where are we going to be? You know, some of those existential questions. Will we be around? We did some work with a co-op of gas producers, natural gas producers, who their generative question was, do we exist in 10 years? Will fossil fuels go away? It doesn't have to be time bound that way, but you're asking questions about what is our purpose and is the organization as constructed the best way to do these things? So this is a probably more thought process than a practical one, but it's a nice one to do because you're not just thinking about today. The world changes around us, and organizations that try to sort of not anticipate what's happening, but flex that muscle or think about, oh, what would happen if tariffs increased by 100% and we no longer had a viable economy? Well, that could never happen. Well, perhaps. But to think through some of these things in advance, you're not trying to game the system or guess what's going to happen. It is to say that we've thought through some things, and it's been like a muscle. You start to think through things, you can respond better in time. So you're trying to figure out, you know, what are the opportunities here? What are the more deeper questions? What's the best way to do things? We build nonprofits and they can be kind of locked into a way of doing things. And sometimes this pushes us to think about different ways of doing things. Now, this can be a challenging thing for staff. I think boards, this is why it's positioned as a board structure, is that staff have built the organization. They run the day-to-day. You're pretty proud of it. You're fighting just to keep things going, and somebody's saying, well, oh, maybe we should blow up the model. It's not the intent, but that's a challenging thing. So this is where it takes some time. There's some discussion, some dialogue, that discerning things. I don't think you spend a lot of time on these, but in each of these areas, you can structure board meetings. We're really good at fiduciary. We're pretty good at information flow, sometimes strategic, it's in a board meeting. Generative, we almost never do. So there's ways you can structure some conversation. There's other ways you can structure this too. And to say, well, perhaps something happens, and we ask ourselves questions along these lines. So if you had a building, you own a building, a rental building or something like that, and you came in one day and there's this giant hole in the roof of your building. You think, that wasn't there yesterday. What questions should I ask myself? So you might think fiduciary-wise, you think, okay, is everybody okay? Do we have insurance? What's it going to cost to fix this? Is there a risk of more holes somehow appearing in my building? Those are great fiduciary questions for the board to ask. Strategically, you may say, okay, well, we're about to put a second story in the building. Is this time to do it? Do some demolition things? Will this change the near trajectory of our organization? Do we need to move the organization? Are we in some sort of asteroid belt somehow all of a sudden? So some strategic things that you might want to think about. Generatively, you may sort of say, geez, why do you have an office at all? Like, why do we have this office that now has a hole in the roof when we never go to this place? So there's questions you can ask yourself along the sort of fiduciary, taking care of things strategically. How does this get from where we are today to where we're going to be in a couple of years to what's the bigger question? Not every incident's going to fit that one, but it's not a bad way to sort of frame some of these materials. Just to, for more time for questions, we'll put it other, just to leave you with some places to go for information. I've talked about some of these things. We have lots on our website. There's videos on sort of, there is videos on our website about different elements of sort of working boards, a little more definition on that, some board challenges. Board as team, I think I have one up there on that too. But some IntegralOrg ones. Some places to go that are open access. Some of these are mostly Canadian, some Albertan. The Imagine Canada Standards program, and so there's a accreditation for non-profits out there in Canada by Imagine Canada. The nice thing about it is you don't have to go through the accreditation and pay for it. It gives you all the questions of how to build on the governance side of the things. How do you build a good board? Questions to ask yourself. Do you have these policies? Do you have these role things? So as a guideline to say, where do I need to tune up? It's a nice little framework. If you choose to pay for accreditation, fair enough. But without that, it gives you some sort of layways to think these are questions to ask ourselves. The board development program it changes names right now and then. The community development unit of the Alberta government is nice. They have lots of print materials. They'll come and do some conversations for you if you can book them. What I like about these folks and this body of materials is it's Alberta based. And so if you're in Alberta, a lot of folks are, you're getting jurisdictionally appropriate materials. Again, the Professional Accountant Canada, I spoke about them, really good materials. Board Source, I pulled a couple pieces from there. Board Source is an American group. So anything that's regulatory-wise, like rules or fiduciary duties, take that with a grain of salt. In terms of group processes of what a board should do, roles and responsibilities, a little more generic stuff, that's not a bad place for it. So they have great materials. It's just sometimes you pull in materials from the jurisdictions, you get yourself into trouble because it doesn't actually fit. And this idea of legislation governs you, you can't supersede it by just having a policy it doesn't. If there are questions that I haven't rambled through here, I know there's some in advance here. There's a question I had in advance that, the idea of, about who the governance committee should be, who's on it. Committees you have a lot of room with. And should the chair oversee it? Not necessarily the president, I think, in this question. You can structure committees almost any way you want, as long as it's compliant with your bylaws and they don't supersede the act. So your policies can't supersede bylaws, bylaws can't supersede the act. That's why you keep bylaws simple, policies really nimble, because you can change these kind of things. Any questions you want to pop in the chat? That's from Chelsea. I'm not sure there. I should look at these things. So if you want to shut them out too, we can do it like the old-fashioned way of talking. But if you have questions, we'll have a minute left. Maybe that's one. So how can individuals build their capacity as board members? I think great question. Because I think we talk about boards filling. I think of things like this. Understand what a board member is. Understand in your own roles, and we can go a little deeper if you want to have a conversation about that. Understand what boards do as a collective, which is largely not understood. I think boards probably need to do a session like this every year. No matter who you are, I think boards understanding collectively what needs to govern. But then understanding the subject matter areas. So if you're not asked to be professional in a discipline that's not yours, but to know enough about it so you can ask questions or be informed, because you're making those decisions. So know your subject matter, know governance, and help encourage your board as individuals and a collective to do the work. That's a great question. It's a really good question. I'm going to turn it back to Chelsea because we're only going to go right to, but Chelsea, just to wind us up with a bit of closing. Thank you for your time. Again, if you want to talk about any of this, I could talk all day, obviously. So love to keep chat. You can book time, email us on the website. Our job is to walk beside you and to help you do what you want to do. And there's a whole bunch of ways to do that. So thank you for your time. And Chelsea, over to you.
Thank you, Mike, and thank you everyone for your engagement today. We would love to hear your thoughts about today's session through a short survey. I dropped it in the chat just now. You will receive a recording of this as well as the slides in a follow-up email later to your inboxes. But if you can fill out that survey, that would be great. We'd really appreciate your feedback. Also wanted to highlight some of the things we do at IntegralOrg. We work with boards to support their health and development. We offer a range of services related to governance, which includes policy work, board coaching, strat planning, governance review, and evaluative sessions like a board skills evaluation. So these services are meant to help you with a range of governance issues. And so if you're interested, please reach out to us and we can determine which of these supports make sense for you and your organization. Another thing we do at IntegralOrg are consultations and clinics. If you have something that is not so clear about what your next step should be with your nonprofit, and you might require a more in-depth conversation about that, you can reach out to us for more specific support through a short video consultation. And these meetings happen between your team and one of our IntegralOrg experts. Clinics and consultations are part of our mission to educate and support Alberta nonprofits. So we're here to help. You can find out more by going to our website, and I'm going to drop the link in the chat as well. Finally, IntegralOrg is a capacity builder and nonprofit ourselves. Our goal is to equip you with knowledge and support you need to do your best work. So we work with nonprofits at any stage of their life cycle using a multidisciplinary approach to address your most pressing concerns. Please reach out if you'd like some help with your nonprofit today. Thanks again for joining us, and we hope to see you soon.